Hello, I'm Perrin Beatty, President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to the Business of Business. Throughout the COVID-19 crisis, I'll be holding a series of conversations with experts on the impact of the pandemic and how businesses and governments are responding. It's not surprising that here in Canada, we've been focused on the effects of the pandemic in our country, but it's important to keep in mind that we're far from alone in having to deal with the impact of the disease. And that's why, to give us some perspective, I'm particularly pleased to welcome a colleague and a friend, Carolyn Fairbairn. Carolyn is the Director General of the Confederation of British Industry, which is a leading UK business association that represents some 190,000 British businesses. A graduate of Cambridge University, the University of Pennsylvania, and INSEAD, Carolyn has had a distinguished career in business, media, and the government, working for organizations like The Economist, McKinsey, the BBC, and the Office of the Prime Minister. Last year, in recognition of her services to British industry, Carolyn was awarded the Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in the Queen's Birthday Honours List. And most importantly, for those of us in Canada, she's married to a Canadian. Carolyn, welcome. We're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you, Perrin. A real pleasure to be here. And yes, I do feel like I'm an honorary Canadian in many things.
You qualify, and welcome to Canada, even virtually. We're delighted to have you with us today. This has been an eventful year. It's not been quiet for you. You started with having to deal with the impact of Brexit as the UK exited the European Union at the end of January. And then within 2 months, you were plunged into the COVID-19 crisis. How has this gone?
Well, Perrin, it has been the most extraordinary year. And you're right. So the end of January was a landmark moment. The UK, after 3 years of wrangling since after the referendum, finally left the European Union. And we thought that was the biggest and most challenging thing that could happen to the British business community. We are still, actually, we might come back to it, we are still set on a course to leave the European Union at the end of the year. But of course, the COVID-19 crisis has swept all before it. And I can't remember the last time actually I had a real conversation about Brexit. This has totally dominated, Perrin, as I suspect it has in Canada. We had our first death here in the UK at the beginning of March, a very major and very sad day. And since then, we have seen an escalation, very sadly, in the health toll on our country. And just this last week, we passed a very sad moment, which was 20,000 deaths in our country. We moved into a lockdown situation in the UK 5 weeks ago, so 5 weeks and 2 days to be exact. It's a very firm lockdown, and we have restrictions on leaving the house. Everybody is at home. The instruction is simply, you can only leave your home for 3 reasons. You can leave the home to buy essential goods that you need to have, food and other things, medical reasons, or to go to work. And those are the only reasons that you can leave your home. And it's been very challenging. It's been enormously challenging. And we might come on to the effects on business, Perrin, but I think the effects on people have been very dramatic, of families having to stay inside with young children, often in very cramped conditions. We are now just beginning to see the economic toll coming through on our country. I don't know if you saw today, we have our main airline, British Airways, has announced they have now 12,000 people in consultation for redundancy. So we're just beginning to see the very major effect on our economy. We're also beginning now to reflect on a possible easing of lockdown, but at the moment, those conditions remain very, very firmly in place. And the final thing to say, Perrin, I think, is that we are seeing a flattening of that curve, you know, that really important objective that we all share, the flattening of that curve. And we think that that reinfection rate was around about 3 at the beginning of the lockdown. We now think it's about 0.75. It has come down. We are seeing the rate of new admissions into hospital falling. So that conversation about easing lockdown is beginning to happen in the UK.
Sadly, it's a process that takes much longer to come down than it did to go up. And your infection rate and death rate in Britain has been even more tragic and more serious than here in Canada. Let's talk for a minute about the administration of the lockdown. Is this administered at the local level or at the national level? In Canada, it is ultimately provincial governments and municipal governments that set the standards. Now, in the UK, how is this done?
It is done primarily at a UK-wide level, but our devolved nations, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, do have their own jurisdictions around, for example, what businesses can open and close. And that has been it's been very interesting to see some of the differences that have come through. So Scotland, for example, quite early on required all construction sites to close, whereas England didn't. Northern Ireland didn't have a list of essential businesses. It came quite late to define one. And that has created some confusion. I have to be honest, Perrin. It's been one of the challenging issues at the heart of this debate. But what we are now seeing is we have been urging as a business community for politicians from all parties and across all parts of the UK to really try and achieve a consensus. One of the biggest issues at the moment, to give you an example, is about the wearing of masks in public. I don't know if that is very live in Canada. It's extremely live here.
Very much so here as well.
There are obviously a lot of considerations. There is science, this recognition that actually it is, the science is quite difficult because although the infection, you as an infectious person become less infectious, there is the issue around touching your face and there are other things. So at the moment the UK has, the England has not required it. Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, has now advised people to wear masks in public. So it's a little bit of a mixed picture, and I imagine you are seeing a bit of that in terms of your provinces in Canada.
Very much so as well. If we were to be in London today, what about the impact on retailers? Are stores open or closed? Are restaurants open or closed?
So, Perrin, it's very timely that you asked that question. We have just produced our latest retail survey today, and the picture for retail is extremely challenging. About 40% of shops are closed. The impact on retail sales has been to roughly half them. We are seeing food retailing, actually a real success story at the heart of this pandemic. Like many other countries in the food sector, we saw panic buying and stockpiling. Toilet rolls ran out very early in the UK.
Some things are universal.
Some things are truly universal, the things that connect us. But that was a worrying time, I would say. And it probably lasted a couple of weeks, and there were queues, lines, and that was challenging. What we have now seen is I think our supermarkets have responded in an extraordinary way by introducing health measures, social distancing within stores, perspex screens, one-way traffic around the stores, and they have kept the supply chains going. So we now have Tesco, just yesterday, one of our leading food retailers told me they had 97% of their supply chains operational, which is extraordinary. So it is a tale of two pictures, really, Perrin. On the food side, I think real strength, supermarkets open, doing extremely well. Changing consumer behavior, actually interesting in retail. People have gone back to the weekly shop, the major big weekly shop that used to happen years ago. And also we've seen a very significant increase in online shopping. That has gone up by about 60%. However, the flip side of that is restaurants are entirely closed. London, if you walk down the streets of London now, it's a ghost town. All bars are closed, all restaurants are closed. Some of them are doing delivery. They can't do takeaway yet. Some of them are doing delivery, but even there, we've seen businesses trying to make that work, and they've had to close since. What we do have, interestingly, is a category in the middle, which is non-food retail, not restaurants, not food, hardware, some clothing stores, who are beginning to reopen. We have got B&Q, which is a bit like Home Depot, have now opened half of their stores very successfully, actually.
And people can actually go in as opposed to curbside delivery that we have here.
You can actually go in. It has been done in very close consultation with employee groups to create, because confidence is everything. Mm-hmm. And it's been done, I think, extremely well. And what they are doing is borrowing from the supermarket model. So you do have marshals at the front door who are allowing people in one by one. You do have social distancing throughout the store, and you do have the perspex, but it is working. So our retail story is a really painful one. Our restaurant story, a really painful one, but with a few glimmers of hope coming through. And real innovation, I would say, Perrin, in terms of what we're seeing firms experiment with. And one of the things we're trying to do as the CBI, we might come onto it, is how we share those stories and share those examples, because there's an enormous amount of learning that can be shared between businesses.
Very much so. We don't all have to reinvent the wheel for ourselves.
No, we don't. No.
Let's talk for a minute about how government has responded, and particularly government supports for business. One of the things that the British government moved quite quickly. And one of the things that we cited to our government was the support in terms of wage subsidies given in Britain and in Denmark when our government was looking at what sort of response it should have. Can you describe some of the government programs designed to assist business to manage during the crisis?
Absolutely. And we think our government did act at scale, decisively and fast at the very beginning. So if I look back to actually even before the lockdown, the week before the lockdown, Perrin, the Prime Minister on the Monday, I remember it vividly, stood up and said people should not go to restaurants and bars and theatres. And there was an immediate wave of closure and risk of redundancy. We were hearing it from our members literally by the minute. And we immediately went into conversation with the Treasury, with the Chancellor. We have a new Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, who's only been in position 3 weeks, who got us and the unions around the table to work out the solution to this. And by the Friday, the 20th of March, I still remember it, a plan was launched that was of an extraordinary scale. It was a job retention scheme. It was about income support at 80%. And we've been looking at 60%, 65% in Germany. And this was an 80% scheme. And it saved thousands and thousands of jobs, Perrin. And it's been a very hard thing to get going. I'd be interested to know how it's worked in Canada, but the whole technology that it was needed to get the money actually into bank accounts, it has only just landed. So last week, the time between the 20th of March and money actually getting into firms, they were counting the hours. The cash crunch was so serious. So it launched last Monday. It has now dispensed nearly £5 billion of support, income support directly to employees. It has supported, I think, 3.8 million jobs. So that was an enormous thing. And alongside that, we had a loan scheme that launched, and that's had a creakier start, I have to be honest. Making these loan schemes simple has been difficult. So in the early days, there wasn't clarity that personal guarantees weren't allowed. It all went out the door too quickly. So we've had a series of improvements over time. The latest of which was just this Monday, where a particular loan scheme was launched for the very smallest firms because they were really struggling. And they're called bounce back loans. They launched on Monday. They're going to be just a simple form, no verification of future viability, because that was taking up an enormous amount of bureaucratic time. So where we stand now, Perrin, if you'd asked me even 2 weeks ago, I'd have said those packages felt as though they had gaps and they were creaking. Right now, they're actually feeling as though they're in pretty good shape. We monitor emails into us all the time. that is why I think we're beginning to feel that we can turn to the future and start thinking about the next step.
That's excellent news. Here in Canada, it was the same issue. The government, first of all, designed a program. We were actually designing the aircraft as we were flying in it in this instance. So it meant that the government had to go back to the drawing board in a couple of instances to extend the program. But the fundamental issue was one of execution. How quickly could the government get the money into the hands of the people who needed it? And as we talk, that wage subsidy still hasn't arrived.
You haven't got yours into bank accounts yet.
It is beginning, the government is processing applications, or at least it will be. It's taking applications now. It'll be processing applications shortly and then getting money into people's hands. So the real concern is those companies that simply couldn't survive during that hiatus period between lockdown and the time the money actually arrived. And it speaks volumes about the challenge for government having to design a delivery program that simply didn't exist before on a crisis basis.
I mean, I think that's right. One of the things I think we are learning is about the huge importance of our civil service, the capacity of our government to deliver. We've seen examples of real heroism actually from officials. I think the job retention scheme was the biggest technology delivery that HMRC, our tax authorities, have ever done, going back through the payroll system. I think banks have also had to fundamentally transform the way they operate. And I know that they've been working weekends, all night. And of course, it may be the same in Canada, Perrin. Our banks and our civil service have had many people self-isolating. They've had as many as 25% of the workforce themselves at home. So I think execution has been the name of the game, and I think will continue to be, frankly, as we continue to go through the process, with testing, for example, being a very important next stage in terms of execution.
Carolyn, can you give us a sense of the communication between government and CBI? Has it been a very close collaboration between business and government? A common complaint that you hear from business organizations around the world is that they feel unconsulted often about decisions that affect their members. How has the communications been in Britain through this?
I can honestly say, Perrin, that I think it has been good. I think it has been good. And I think you're right. I think we've been through an era where actually that kind of closeness of collaboration between government and business, I think the world over, may not have been where we want it to be. But you know, as Bill Gates said last week, you know, yes, this has many similarities to being a war, except we're all on the same side on this one. And I think that's right. We're all on the same side. And that came over, I think, really strongly right from the beginning. So if I go back to when we literally rolled sleeves up round tables to design that job retention scheme. The same thing around the self-employed. We're now beginning to get into the real challenge of how you reopen in a phased and controlled way. And to give you a concrete example of how that's working here now, Perrin, the business department has set up a series of working groups that are interestingly not sector by sector. They are workplace by workplace. So they are around outdoor work, office work, factories, rigs, and that's quite an interesting approach. And it is business and unions and government and healthcare, health experts around a table. And that is the only way you can do it. And I think what I've been impressed by here is where government has actually recognized that they can't do all this on their own. Another example is we've had shortages of personal protective equipment. I think that again is a global challenge. We've kept very close to our European colleagues. Confederation, for example, you know, our colleagues, Perrin, as you know, in Italy. We could see this coming. We could see this coming. First, there was the PPE challenge in the healthcare system, followed by a PPE challenge in the industrial base. And we've been working with government to try and get ahead of that so that there will be sufficient capacity for the PPE needed to get the restart underway as well as in healthcare. So, you know, I think it's actually been an example of what you can achieve when you have business and government working together. And my hope is that we will be able to take some of this experience into the post-pandemic era around issues like sustainability and how we create a better skilled workforce, and all of those massive issues that we have been arguing for partnership for a long time. I think this pandemic is showing how partnership can really deliver for people on the ground.
I want to come back a little bit later to the question of what the post-pandemic agenda needs to be for government, because that'll be debate in Britain as it is in Canada as well. But could you describe first the role of CBI during the pandemic? You have a key role on behalf of your 190,000 members, but you're on lockdown, same as we are. How have you been managing?
Well, I have to say it's been the most extraordinary experience for our organisation, and actually a very fulfilling and rewarding one, I have to say, Perrin. We moved into we moved to home working 6 weeks ago now. So 7 weeks ago, actually. We were a week before the big social distancing announcement, 2 weeks before the official lockdown, and we are entirely at home. So we are a team of 250 people worldwide and across the UK. We are all at home. Our technology has been terrific. We have our Zoom problems, but in general, we are able to operate very well. And we set ourselves very quickly a few big goals. First of all, we wanted to be the point of information for our members around what's actually going on. So we've set up a coronavirus hub that, interestingly, we decided very early on we'd open up to all British businesses, not just our members. And that has been very welcome. We have on that, we have a lot of our own content. We have government links. We host what we call virtual rooms around particular issues, PPE, or how you create social distancing in the workplace. And we host a daily webinar, which now has several thousand people tuning into it. So that's the first thing, an information hub, and it's been, I think, invaluable for members. I think, secondly, we have been at the bridge between the business community and government, taking that evidence base in so that we get good policy. And it's it goes back to that point about partnership. That hasn't worked maybe as well as we'd have wanted to in the past. It has worked well here. That question of trust that government has in the CBI being evidence-based, we are able to tell a lot of stories directly from our members around what they're experiencing. So that's been the second goal. And then I think the third role that we've been playing actually is an international one. And that's why I'm so delighted to be here talking to you today, Perrin. I think that there is a role for international coordination here. And international best practice, where organisations like ours have a really profound role to play. And I think particularly as we start coming out of this, we will be working, as you will, at the B7 level. We work with Business Europe to create the right kind of European conditions. We may be outside the European now, but outside the European Union, but we are still European. So those have been the big roles that we have been playing. And there's one final one, which I think is going to be increasingly important. It is this sharing of best practice across businesses. As I described, the fact that we have got retailers who've done so extraordinarily well during this pandemic, how we take that experience and share it with our other members. We had a webinar this morning where we had over 1,000 businesses on the line, and we had the chairman of Tesco retailer and Barratt Homes, a construction firm, and the CEO of Airbus, one of our biggest aerospace companies, all talking about the lessons that they have learned about keeping their operations going. And we are sharing that across our entire membership base so that we can help the country to open as safely as it possibly can. So a lot of different roles. I mean, I have to say, I feel extraordinarily proud of my organisation. People have stepped up and gone beyond the call of duty day in, day out. And I think, as I say, I think it's been a very rewarding, challenging, but very rewarding experience.
Crisis really is a test of character, and it's remarkable to see how people rise to the occasion. You were mentioning the issue of reopening and your proximity to Europe, obviously. On the continent, we are seeing countries now decontrolling reopening. That must be adding to pressure on British business to reopen. What stage is this at? Have you got the conditions set at this point as to knowing when or how business will reopen? And when would you see this happening?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, Perrin. We are seeing reopening steps being taken in Germany, in Denmark, in Italy, just announced towards the end of last week. You have the French moves on May the 11th that have been previewed. And it is creating certainly the questions. It's posing the questions, and it's creating some pressure. Although there is a very strong commitment to safety first, and the recognition that that's not, health is absolutely paramount. The confidence of consumers and employees is absolutely paramount. And so I'm being very clear that business is sitting here, yes, impatient to open, but not reckless. And so our government has set 5 conditions that have to be met before there will be a relaxation of the lockdown. And they are health measures. To give you an example, that we are confident that the NHS won't be overwhelmed. We've actually been very successful in the UK, despite the tragically high death toll. We have not seen nobody who's needed a ventilator hasn't got one. So we must not move into a stage where the NHS is overwhelmed. The death toll has to be falling. We have to know we have the PPE equipment available to be able to cope with the next stage. So we as a business community support those 5 health-related tests very strongly. What we are saying in parallel to that, though, is that we need a plan for a plan. Now is time to start the blueprint conversations about what should happen when we do open. And some of the considerations that we have around that. there are some principles that we are really advocating. We really are advocating that this should be we all need to do this together. It will be the right conversation and the right forums between unions and government and health and business to get the right opening. We heard that very clearly from Airbus this morning, who have managed to keep a lot of their operations open, but unions have been absolutely central to that. So that's a hugely important principle. We also are advocating an approach which we're calling flexibility within a framework. So government sets the framework for what health standards should be observed in the workplace, but leave business the flexibility to innovate, because that's what we have seen during this period so far, that we will have the safest, fastest, best opening if you give businesses the flexibility within that framework. And we have another principle, which is, as we do go through the restart period, let's think about building back better. Let's think about how things are done differently in this restart process, because there's so much that we're learning. There's such an opportunity to think radically. So Perrin, where we are in the UK, we're not ready to lift the lockdown yet. Our health conditions aren't met. But I think you have the right conversations happening. I think the principles are being established. And that when we are ready to do that, I think we've got the mechanisms in place to be able to do that well and to do that safely.
You anticipated I have 2 more questions. You anticipated the next one, and that is, how is the economy being changed? When you talk to your members, are you hearing the same thing from yours as I'm hearing from mine, that we're not going to go back to doing business the way that we did before? Digitization has made a major change for us. We've discovered new products. We've discovered new ways of organizing ourselves. How do you see the British economy and British business evolving as a result of this?
Oh, Perrin, I think it's been extraordinary. As somebody described the other day, we're seeing it in all sorts of walks of life. Someone described to me the other day that the NHS was like a rhino pirouetting. What we are seeing is large, historically slow to change organisations that have changed at the speed of light. We have teachers who are giving online lessons on Zoom to their students in a way that you would not have thought possible, and we are seeing this in business in spades. I think one of the things that's been very striking is how successful, I mean, I'll come back, notes of caution, but how successful this massive move to working from home has been. I think that has taken people by surprise, and I'd be interested to know if it's the same in Canada, that the ability to actually conduct business remotely and successfully, I think has been revolutionary. And I've heard a lot of businesses already talk about how they may really reconsider what property they need. You may really get massive productivity improvements going back as we reconfigure our offices. And in a world where we know productivity has been flat and that has been a challenge, how we all go digital, I think, is going to be a really, really big and interesting question. But I think it's more profound than that. I mean, that's the productivity side of things. I think that there are also just big questions now being asked around how we really take sustainability seriously. It's very interesting. After the financial crash, sustainability and the climate went on to the back burner. And people, I think, at the beginning of this pandemic were asking the question, will that happen this time too? I don't think it will. I don't think it will. Everything I hear is this is an opportunity for us to, this is happening in an extraordinarily and overly dramatic way, but the fact that we have a planet that is breathing again, that we are conscious, I think, of our own mortality. Actually, there are some really fundamental things here. And that businesses, I think, feel an enormous responsibility to do things differently for the planet as we come out of this. I think it has also focused attention on how valued the key workers on the front line are. We are celebrating here in the UK, I think, are people who are perhaps the lowest paid in our society, but giving the most extraordinary value. And that is the people who are working in our supermarkets, people on the front line of the health service, people who are collecting the rubbish, garbage, trash on our streets, are the fifth emergency service. So I think there are all sorts of ways where, as we come back to build our businesses, we will be putting fairness, sustainability, productivity, the use of digital at the heart of those decisions. And I think, if you'd asked me 3 or 4 weeks ago, I'd have thought it was sequential, that we would do the restart first and think about that renewal journey later. I don't think we can wait. I think that we have to be thinking about those things right now. And this has to be transformation from the beginning.
You've just led me then to the final question. That's the public policy agenda. You mentioned changes in people's sensibilities, the sense of the role of business in society as a member of society, and how we treat people. There's also the role of government, and I anticipate we've added vast amounts of government debt, not just in Canada, but in the UK and elsewhere. And the question is, do we go back to the old public policy agenda, or do we have to refocus on fundamental economic issues? And how do we make the transition from an economy which is being driven today by government to one which becomes driven by the private sector again, and where growth is taking place in the private sector? And instead of a subsidy-based economy, that we have one that is based on growth and on private activity. Will there be a major debate in Britain on that? And how do you see that going?
I think there's going to be a major debate globally on that, Perrin. I mean, the drama of this is that we will, at the end of this crisis period, have nationalised large parts of our economy. I mean, we've seen both the value of government, but I think it has also made us realise the value of private business as well, and how we get a transition back to that, I think is a fundamental question. A couple of thoughts on it. First of all, I think that the support packages really matter, because the less scarring that you can have in this period of lockdown and crisis, the more the more you have to recover with. And I think our government really understands that. That's why the scale of the intervention was so fast and so momentously large. We are still going to have scarring, though. I fear that is unavoidable. And we are therefore going to need to have the safety mechanisms in place. Our state is going to have to grow before it shrinks. We're going to have people we need to really care for. But then I think coming out of this, it is going to be, what are the stimulus, the demand side measures that are going to be needed to refloat a strong private sector? And I think business is going to take that responsibility extremely seriously. How that we can reallocate resources into the growth parts of the economy to rehire people, to create new jobs for the future. One of the things I think that is the next wave of partnership between business and government to make this all work is the whole challenge around retraining. I am convinced that we are going to need a different shaped workforce. We needed a different shaped workforce before this crisis. That has been accelerated. And if we can get, so that's why I think a bigger state before we have a smaller state. I think one of the biggest issues for me, which I haven't resolved in my own mind yet, is how we deal with the debt. What we know that we don't want is a decade of austerity. We have had a decade of austerity in the UK. And I think a lot of people would argue that given this is going to be global, we need a new macroeconomic solution to the challenge of major global debt. I think this is where the coordination across countries will come in. And I don't see any solution that doesn't involve higher taxes. I think that is going to be an inevitable part of the picture. But we might be able to do that over a long time period, Perrin, I think, and enable some of these big investments in the future around sustainability, around training to be made. But I'm by and large, I think this is going to be an extraordinarily painful period, but I am by and large optimistic. I just have watched the innovation, the rhinos pirouetting, the innovation that we've seen from civil servants and from business. It's only 5 weeks that we've been in lockdown and we've seen whole business models transform. Take that forward into this new world with all that we have learned, with, I think an increase in compassion, actually. I think that there have been some important things around our values that have been changed by this. I am, over the longer term, a real optimist that we can bring some good out of this and actually create, for our next generation of young people coming through. They may be the COVID generation now, but we can, I think, create something that feels actually optimistic and full of opportunity for them.
Well, it's a very good note to leave it on, Carolyn. We're in a new world. It's an adventure for all of us, painful. It's not an easy transition for us to make. There's so much that we can learn from each other. But thank you so much today for sharing your insights with us. And thank you for the leadership that you're providing on behalf of British industry. It's important not just in Britain, but throughout the world.
Perrin, pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.